Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Kuto and I'm the Communications Coordinator at TechSoup Canada. I'd like to thank you all and welcome you for joining us today. Our webinar is a refresher for nonprofits on the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, also known as the AODA. And we're very pleased to be able to put on this webinar in partnership with the Ontario Nonprofit Network and Accessibility Ontario as part of the Enabling Nonprofits Ontario initiative, which was supported by the Government of Ontario. And now before we get started, I'd like to first quickly introduce you to TechSoup Canada. Our mission at TechSoup Canada is to help nonprofits use technology effectively, and we accomplish this in two ways. The first is to make technology products more affordable through our technology donations program. We partner with corporations such as Microsoft, Adobe, and Symantec, and we offer their products as either an outright donation or at a significant discount for charities, nonprofits, and libraries across Canada. So for example, if you want a copy of Microsoft Office Professional, you can expect to purchase it for around $500 online or in store. However, if you're a TechSoup Canada member and you qualify for our Microsoft Donations program, you can get Office Pro for $61. So as you can imagine, the cost savings can become quite significant, especially if you're purchasing software for your entire staff. So creating a TechSoup Canada account is free, and if you'd like to get more information, please visit our website at techsoupcanada.ca/getting_started. The second way we try to help nonprofits use technology effectively is by creating and curating nonprofit tech resources. So we write blogs, we curate content on social media, and we host events and webinars like this one to help nonprofits learn more about the technologies that can help them in their day-to-day work. So if there's a topic that you'd like to learn more about, please let us know. We're always delighted to get feedback from our members about what topics are important to them. Now just a few logistics for today's webinar. You can use the GoToWebinar panel on your right-hand side to change your audio settings, enter your questions in the queue box, and chat with us, again using the question box. At the end of the webinar presentation, we will have a formal Q&A session where I'll ask questions directly to the speaker on your behalf. And just another reminder that you are on mute, so if you have any questions or concerns or anything you'd like to say during the presentation, you can use the question box and chat to us directly. On another note, now this webinar is being recorded, and we will upload the video on our website shortly, and we will email all our participants just to let you know when those resources become available online. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Constance Exley. Constance is the CEO of Accessibility Ontario and has led AODA workshops and webinars to over 2,000 organizations. She has worked on enabling changes projects for several years now to provide AODA education and training to nonprofits and businesses throughout the province. Constance is currently the Project Facilitator, Curriculum and Training for the Ontario Nonprofit Network's year-long Enabling Nonprofits project and the project manager for the Ontario BIA Association's Ability Smart Businesses initiative. And we're happy to have her here with us today to talk about what nonprofits need to know about the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass the presentation over to Constance.
Hi, Matt. Thanks so much. That was a great introduction. And again, everyone, this is Constance Exley, and I'm with Accessibility Ontario and working with the Ontario Nonprofit Network on their Enabling Nonprofits project. Now, today's webinar is going to give you an overview of the AODA and what's required of you. And you'll notice as we go through that a lot of the webinar content has been developed with nonprofits in mind, but I've also included some information about the AODA and deadlines for educational institutions and libraries and publishers in the resources handout that is available to you. So you might just see that slight difference, but I just want to let you know that there is definitely some resources available for those of you who may be a library or school. As Matt mentioned, this project is in partnership with the Ontario government, and over the last 8 months, ONN has been hosting workshops and webinars on the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or as I call it, and I will refer to it now going forward, as the AODA. One of the other things that the Ontario Nonprofit Network has been doing as part of this project is developing some case studies and sharing best practices and also hosting some tweet chats The most recent tweet chat we did was talking about accessible communications and how to ensure that your social media is accessible. So all of that information you can find on ONN's website, and we've given you a link at the end in our resources for you to go and explore a little bit more. The webinars that we've done in the past have been recorded, so again you can access those and view them. And we have a couple more coming up in the next 2 weeks, so I'll tell you about those at the end if you'd like to join us for them. Now, as we begin our conversation today, I wanted to first chat about accessibility and why accessibility is important. So first of all, before I tell you my thoughts, I'd like to hear from you guys, so why you think accessibility is important. You'll notice over on the right-hand side of your screen that there is a questions box. So I would ask you to share with us, everybody will be able to see, and I'll be highlighting some of the comments that you share as well. Tell me why you think what are some of the reasons that accessibility is important, both for you as an individual, for your organization, and as well as for our communities. So type in some of your thoughts about why you think accessibility is important. Why are we having this conversation? Why was there a legislation passed by the Ontario government? Why is accessibility important? Great, so I can see some of you are typing some things in, so let me share some of your comments. So Susan says improved accessibility for individuals with disabilities means improved accessibility for all, which is fabulous, yes. So Susan gives some examples. Better access for mobility devices and also easier for moms with strollers. Fabulous answer, Susan, thanks. Megan says reduces barriers for access. Absolutely. Deb says it's important for inclusion and independence. Absolutely, yeah. Marcia says to include everyone in society, as we all have some sort of disability at some point in our life. And that's very true, Marcia, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Lori says equality. Yeah, absolutely, very important. Tricia says community living. I guess Tricia's with community living. So community living wants every citizen to have equal access to the community. And community living does excellent work in communities across the province. So if you don't know their work, definitely check out their website. Let's take a couple more. So we've got Tony says it's important because it conveys respect for all individuals. And finally, Daniela says, without this, we exclude lots of people and create more barriers. Fabulous answers. Thanks, everybody. So as we can see, accessibility is not just good for people with disability, it's good for everyone. So some examples of how accessibility can benefit not just people with disabilities would be, for instance, seniors who might have mobility difficulties or vision or hearing loss. When they visit a website that's accessible, that makes a huge difference for them being able to access the content. Another one would be families traveling with young children using strollers, which is an example that someone gave. And they might need wider aisles when shopping, and all of us can benefit from that if it's more accessible. People carrying shopping bags, parcels, really appreciate when there is an automatic door opener. So sometimes we think about those being just for people with disabilities, and in fact, many of us use those when we've got our hands full or we've got strollers and that kind of thing. And another example would be when people are in a noisy restaurant or a bar or in the gym and they get to watch TV and there's captioning. It means that they can actually hear what's going on or read what's going on even if they can't hear it. So those are all examples, and there's many, many, many examples of how accessibility is becoming an increasing part of our life and part of what we think about and design into all parts of our life, in our built environments, in our communications, in our attitude, and all of that goes a long way to ensuring that Ontario is as accessible as possible. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some specifics. Again, why accessibility is important. So, changing demographics. So there are a number of reasons, and one of them is that we have an aging population. In 2013, 1.7 million people were over the age of 65 in Ontario alone. That number is expected to grow significantly. In fact, the Globe and Mail recently reported that there are now more seniors than children in Canada. And remember, as we grow older, our chances of acquiring a disability grow as well. Another reason is that accessibility is important because there are currently 1.65 million people in Ontario who have a disability. So that's equivalent to 15.4% of Ontario's population. And that means, again, translated, approximately 1 in every 7 Ontarians have a disability. Now, what's interesting is statistics, can be crunched in lots of different ways. And there's another interesting statistics that is shared by the Canadian Mental Health Association. And they say that 1 in 5 Canadians will develop a mental health issue at some point in their life. So that means if that's just one type of disability, mental health, 1 in 5, then we know if we add in all of the other types of disabilities that we're looking at more than 1 in 7. But the point being is that there's a lot of people with disabilities, and that is increasing. Another is around economic benefits. So we can't afford not to meet our community's changing needs and demands. It's also worth noting that an accessible Ontario is good for the economy. If you combine people with disabilities, their friends, family, and their colleagues, they represent approximately 63% of the population. And these people are more likely to support an organization or a business that demonstrates a commitment to accessibility. According to the Conference Board of Canada, people with disabilities represent a consumer spending base of $25 billion. And the Martin Prosperity Institute estimates that by 2031, the income controlled by people with disabilities and those at risk of a disability, so they count people who are over the age of 55, in Canada will represent $536 billion in consumer spending. So it's quite significant. Another is employer benefits. So a recent Conference Board of Canada research report indicated that job vacancies in Ontario could reach in 2020 up to 190,000 job vacancies. In 2025, that number will rise to 364,000 job vacancies, and in 2030 it will rise again to 564,000 job vacancies in Ontario alone, which is, again, pretty staggering numbers. So with a labor or skills shortage, Ontario may be increasingly dependent on a workforce currently with disabilities and or people working beyond current retirement age, when accessibility needs tend to become more and more readily apparent in the workforce. People with disabilities represent an untapped talent pool with significant labor market potential. Statistics show that employees with disabilities often score higher than their coworkers in job performance and job retention. Yet the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is approximately 3 times as high compared to people without disabilities. By more fully integrating people with disabilities into the labor market, there's a potential to increase employment income in Ontario by up to $618 million. So, some interesting numbers. Now, let's talk about what is considered a disability. Disabilities can come in many different forms. Some disabilities are permanent, while others are temporary. Some are intermittent, and others are progressive. I'm going to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, to share some examples of an intermittent disability. And again, you can do this in the question pod. So go ahead and give me some examples of what you think would be an intermittent disability. So we've got broken leg, says Kaylin. Arthritis, says Andrina. Sorry, I'm getting your name wrong. Some forms of multiple sclerosis, great. Dialysis, says Peter. Question mark for mental health, says Megan. Yeah, that can definitely be an intermittent disability, depending on the nature of it. Post-surgical, that's a great one, Marcia, because sometimes, again, when we think about disabilities, we forget that there can be situations where you might, for instance, like have a broken leg, or you might undergo surgery, or you might undergo chemotherapy for cancer, and during those periods you might actually have some disabilities that are temporary and associated with that. Rick also says depression, which is a great example because it's fairly prevalent, so it's one that we really need to be aware of. Chronic fatigue syndrome, says Dan. Back injuries is another good one. We're quite a sedentary society, so we can see that one increasing more and more. So these are great. Now, how about if I switch to progressive disabilities? Some examples of progressive disabilities. In other words, disabilities that get worse over time. What would be some examples? So Deb says Parkinson's. Tony says dementia, great examples. MS, multiple sclerosis, says Megan again. It can be one that is progressive for sure. Cancer, yeah, and that's one that could be intermittent, potentially, can be progressive. Some of these you'll see can be both. Carpal tunnel syndrome absolutely can be progressive. Mobility issues, let's see, Sandra says mobility issues related to aging. Yeah, good example. Let's see, ALS is Susan, and my last one will be from Deborah, and that's dementia. So excellent examples. So the reason why I wanted just to highlight that is as we go forward and we talk about the legislation and we talk about your requirements, we talk about disabilities, sometimes people have a tendency to think about disabilities that are permanent and disabilities that are visible. And we know that that's not the case. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you about invisible disabilities as well. And so we need to think about when we're following up on our requirements under the AODA to keep our thinking broad about what constitutes a disability, to recognize that disabilities can change. They can be, as we talked about, they can be progressive, they can be intermittent. And when you're doing your training with your staff, and I'll be talking about that, you have to also talk about that, those kinds and the range of disabilities. Now, sometimes I get asked about what is the definition used by the AODA for disability. And the AODA uses the same definition as is used in the Ontario Human Rights Code. Ontario Human Rights Code. So these include things like deafness and hearing loss, intellectual and developmental disabilities, learning disabilities, mental health disabilities, physical disabilities, and vision loss. So this is not a 100% comprehensive list, but it starts to give you an idea of what are included in the list of a disability. And if you go onto the Ontario Human Rights website, you can find out the much more detailed and descriptive explanation of what constitutes a disability, should you want to know. Now, as I mentioned, some disabilities are visible and some are invisible. So when I talk about a visible disability, I mean one that you can actually see. So looking at someone, you can see that they have a disability. And so that could be, for example, somebody who uses a wheelchair would be an example of that. Can I get from you some examples of an invisible disability? So disabilities that you cannot see. So Sandra says deafness, that's a great example. Vision loss, says Daphne. Anxiety, that's a really excellent one for an invisible disability. That came from Patty. Fibromyalgia, says Layla. Another, Diane also said anxiety. Yeah, mental health, says Wendy. So lots of you are mentioning anxiety, which is really interesting, and you're right. It is an invisible one. It is one that we often don't think about. Learning disability, says Carol. Yvette, could you tell me what the FASD, the acronym, stands for so I can share that with folks? Depression, says Rosa. Memory difficulties, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Allergies. Allergies can potentially count, and again, that's where looking at that, the complete definition under the Ontario Human Rights Code will be really good. Some, like peanuts, can have very severe reactions. So do take a look at that. Let's see if we've got that definition for FASD. Brent, thanks, Yvette. So fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Another example from Marcia was a cognitive disability as an invisible disability. And Deb, finally, it says an acquired brain injury. Now, I'd like to ask you, so as I said, there's visible disabilities and there's invisible disabilities. What percentage of disabilities do you think are visible? In other words, you could actually see that somebody had a disability. What percentage of disabilities are visible? I'll give you a second to put in some answers here. Well, so far you're all in the right direction, which is great, and that is low. Um, the answers ranged from 1% to 45%. Most of you said sort of around the 20 to 30%, which is fabulous, because in fact, the answer is 30%. So only 30% of disabilities are visible. And so the companion statistic is that 70% of disabilities are invisible. And when we, again, talk about the work that we need to do under the AODA, when we talk about the ways that we can make our organizations more accessible, we need to not just think about the obvious visible disabilities, but the invisible disabilities as well. Now, the AODA was set out to really address some of the major barriers to accessibility that people with disabilities identified. These are not all of them, but there's some of them. And you'll see as I start to move in and talk about the legislation that it was very much designed to try to help to break down some of these barriers that were identified. So there's physical barriers, architectural barriers, information and communication barriers, attitudinal barriers, that's a big one, technology barriers, and policy and practice barriers. Now, accessibility can mean lots of different things to many different people. So when we talk about accessibility in the context of the AODA, what are we talking about? Here we're talking about giving people of all abilities an opportunity to participate in everyday life. So it's really more than just ramps or automatic door openers. It's about changing attitudes, like making assumptions about what someone can or cannot do, or making an assumption maybe that if they have one disability that they might have more disabilities. It's about inclusion and welcoming and making everyone feel like they belong. It's about understanding that people with disabilities have different needs, and one of the things that we can do to find out what those needs are is to simply start off a conversation by saying, how can I help? Is there something I can do? Now, the AODA is a legislation that I have to say gets me very excited. I've been working in the nonprofit sector for many, many, many years in many different sort of fields, but this has been very exciting for me over the last 6 years working, supporting organizations, learning about the AODA, because the change that I have seen in our communities in Ontario has been incredible in the short time that the AODA has been around. And in fact, Ontario is Canada's leader in the area of accessibility. Now, Ontario was the first jurisdiction in the world to mandate accessibility reporting and training. It is also the first jurisdiction in the world that requires public and private sector organizations to train not only their staff on accessibility and on the Ontario Human Rights Code as it relates to people with disabilities, but also volunteers. And Ontario is the only jurisdiction in Canada with legislation that sets out a clear goal and time frame in which to meet that goal, which is accessibility in the areas that most impact the daily lives of people with disabilities. And the target for that is 2025. Now, since the AODA was created, other provinces and actually other countries have been looking and following the work that the government has been doing on this legislation and how organizations on the ground have been enacting it and making it a part of their work. And it has inspired others to move in this direction of creating a legislation. So Manitoba is working on it, as are other provinces. So if you're curious to see what's going on in other provinces, you can do a little Google search for that, and it's quite amazing. Now, the AODA is actually a mandatory legislation, so it's not one that you can choose to follow and adhere to. I will explain who has to comply, but I also wanted to talk about that the Act gives the government the authority to set monetary penalties to enforce compliance. And the AODA, as I'll explain in a minute, has a number of requirements and deadlines that are being rolled out between, it started in 2010, and it continues until 2021. There's also penalties that can be used by the government if compliance assistance efforts have been exhausted and an organization is still not compliant. And there's regular audits and inspections and enforcement happening. So you just need to be aware of that That is going on. The government doesn't work in a kind of a punitive manner on this. They very much want to work with you to ensure you're compliant, and there's lots of organizations such as ONN that have resources to support you. But it is not an optional legislation to follow. You must follow it. Now here we can see a visual of the legislation. Now the AODA was legislated in 2005, and it has 5 accessibility standards which are being phased in terms of the requirements and implementation and full compliance between now and 2021. Having said that, it is also a living document, and built into it is a requirement that each standard get reviewed every few years to see if there's any changes that need to be made. So that has happened for the customer service standard, and for the others they will be happening soonish. When exactly, we don't know, but soonish. Now the standards apply to all sectors, including government, public sector, not-for-profits, and the private sector. And the conditions are that if you provide any goods or services or facilities directly to the public or to other businesses or other organizations, and you have at least 1 employee, then you have to comply with all of the standards under the AODA. There's a couple of exceptions, and I'll note those now in case there's anybody participating today that would fall in this category. There are 2 exceptions of people or groups that don't need to comply. One is if there's a nonprofit that has no staff, no employees, and they do not need to comply with the AODA. Or if you're self-employed as a consultant, you're not incorporated, but you're self-employed, you have no employees, then you also don't need to comply with the AODA. However, I'm certainly getting calls from consultants who are saying that in order to get a contract with a particular client, they need to provide proof that they are compliant with the AODA. So that's starting to happen as well. Now before we go on, I want to just check in with you to make sure that we're all on the same page. And Matt, maybe I'll just ask you if you don't mind continuing to clear out the questions box so that we can continue to use that. But I wanted to ask folks, can you tell me how you think the AODA defines an employee? So as we go forward, I'm going to be talking about the requirements under the AODA, and there's certain requirements for certain size organizations, certain types of organizations, and corresponding dates with those. So it's important that you know how to count your employees and whether that makes you a large or a small organization as we go forward and as you look at your requirements. So let's see. So Dale has responded and said, so if, okay, so that's a question for later. So Matt will kind of copy that over and ask it during the Q&A box, rather during the Q&A time, Dale. So if you can hang on to that. So definition of an employee. We have Joe saying paid or unpaid workers. Mary says anyone on payroll. Deb says the same thing. Suzanne says someone who is paid to perform work. Okay, so you're all on the same lines. Now, Marcia says someone who is paid or represents your organization, i.e. a contractor or a volunteer. Okay, so this is why I asked the question, because I wanted us to be clear before we go forward. Under the AODA, the definition of an employee is someone who works for you full-time, part-time, seasonal, or on contract. It does not include volunteers. You do have some obligations as it relates to volunteers, such as training. But when you're looking at determining the size of your organizations and what you need to do to meet your compliance requirements by certain dates, you would only look at the employees that you have that work for you full-time, part-time, seasonal, or contract over the course of a year. If at any point in the course of a year you bump up to the next kind of level, you go from being a small organization to being a large organization, at that point you need to take a look at what are the obligations and the deadline dates for a large organization and work towards meeting those revised timelines. So let's talk here about the standards. So you can see we've got the AODA at the top, then we have over to the left the customer service standard. The customer service standard was legislated in 2008. It was the first standard to become law. And then after that, there were a few that came out at the same time, and the government created sort of a bit of a sub-umbrella under the AODA called the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation. And so the reason that was created was that each of the 4 remaining standards have specific requirements to their subject area. However, there are some overarching requirements that touch on all of them, including training, including policy development. So, and again, I'm going to review all this as we go forward today. That's what we're going to talk about. But I just wanted you to understand the sort of the setup of how the AODA works and sort of what is the IASR. And so the remaining 4 standards under the AODA are the Communications and Information Standard, Employment Standard, Transportation Standard, and Design of Public Spaces Standard. Not all of these may apply to you, and as I go through, I'll talk a little bit more about them. So you can find out if, in fact, you need to meet those requirements. So let's start off with a customer service standard. This standard is really about influencing attitudes and behaviors and getting organizations to really think about how they interact with their customers or their clients in such a way that, again, when we think about 70% of disabilities are invisible, many of us will have clients or customers that may have a disability that we're not aware of. And so there needed to be some sort of general awareness, the fact that there was a legislation that had been developed called the AODA, and that there was some expectations, basic expectations of organizations, for-profits, non-profits, public sector, and government, to meet, to ensure that people with disabilities receive respectful service and that they are able to access, information and employment opportunities within your organization and so on. So here you'll see the word customer, and so the AODA uses the word customer to be a sort of a generic term for what maybe your organization refers to as client, member, or the public. So whatever word you use, just do the translation when I use the word customer or when you're reading the word customer in terms of the legislation. The AODA applies to 360,000 organizations across the province. So that's from, big banks in downtown Toronto to small corner stores in, Thunder Bay. So quite the range. And so for that reason, there's some things like this, the term customer, that was chosen to be trying to appeal and attract the broadest range of organizations that needed to be compliant. In the nonprofit world, we don't tend to use the word customer so much, but anyways, long explanation about that. So here are some of your obligations under the customer service standard. As an organization, you need to develop and put into place a plan or a policy that outlines how you'll provide your goods and services to people with disabilities. Your policy or your plan has to make sure that you welcome service animals into public areas of your organization, unless a service animal is excluded by another law, which there is one, and that is in food preparation areas. So a service animal is allowed in an area where people are eating, such as a restaurant or a cafeteria, but a service animal would not be allowed, or any other animal for that matter, in an area where food is being prepared. So you also need to make sure that you allow people to use their assistive devices, so any kind of equipment like a wheelchair or a screen reader, a listening device or cane that they might need to sort of help them with daily living. You have to allow people to bring their assistive devices onto your property and into your programs and your services. You also have to allow people to bring their support person with them to your work. And so in some cases, some of you may charge admission, either admission to entry into a facility, admission into a program, admission to an event. And so what you're required here is to make a policy decision about whether or not somebody who has a support person with them will be charged for themselves as well as their support person. So you could decide that you're going to charge the person with a disability the same as everyone else, but for their support person, you're only going to charge 50% of that price. or you're going to charge nothing, or you're going to charge 100%. It's up to you, but what you need to do is make a decision about what fees, if any, a support person will be charged, and you need to put that into your policy, and you need to make sure that you share that information publicly so that people know ahead of time if there's a fee for their support person. And where you could post that would be in wherever you share information about that program or that event or that service that people would normally have to pay for. So such as your website, maybe on a poster if you're creating one. If you want to be proactive, you could include a message about the event and information about a support person on your phone. So there's lots of different ways that you can do that. And that's your only requirement. The government doesn't say what you have to charge, just that you need to make a decision about what, if anything, you're going to charge someone who has a support person. Your plan should also ensure that staff know what's expected of them when they communicate with customers with disabilities, and that's where you have the training component. And so training your staff and your volunteers becomes really important. You need to train them on the requirements of the customer service standard, about the legislation and its goals. You would talk about how to communicate with people with different types of disabilities. So again, you'd think about who frequents your programs and your services, people who have visible and invisible disabilities, and talk about how can you provide a respectful service, what accommodations might be required. So you think about all that. Now there may be scenarios where you have a staff person or a volunteer and they are not sure how to handle the situation. Maybe somebody is needing assistance, somebody with a disability, they're requiring accommodation, and they're not quite sure how to handle it. Part of what you need to do is to let those people know how to, where to go to get help. Should they go to a manager, a supervisor, and that kind of thing. The other thing that you need to let people know about is if there's some services that are temporarily unavailable that somebody with a disability might access, and that could be maybe it's an automatic door, maybe it's a ramp, maybe it's an accessible washroom. If for some reason any of those become unavailable, there's an interruption of service, you need to let people know so that they can plan accordingly. How you let them know will again depend on your organization, depend on the scenario. But let's say, for instance, you're in a building with elevators and the elevators are undergoing maintenance. You'd need to post a sign that lets people know that the elevators are no longer working, how long that interruption will be going on for, and if there's any alternative elevators that they could use. So there may be another bank of elevators down the hallway that they might otherwise not know about, but with that information that you've given them, they can still come to your office. So just let people know ahead of time, and again, use all the different kinds of ways. You know, some people are using social media, like in Toronto, the TTC, if they have an interruption of service, they are posting things on not only their website, but they're doing it on Twitter. So think about all the different ways that you can communicate with people, because it can be a problem if someone is coming. You know, they've made arrangements. It's been, yeah, there's been a bit of effort involved to get them to your location, only to find out that they can't actually get into your office. Finally, the last thing there is inviting customers to provide feedback. So one of the requirements is that you create a way, if you don't have one already, a way that people can give you feedback on how accessible your customer service is, and if there's something that maybe you could do to improve the inclusion of everybody. And so if you have a way to collect feedback, that's great. If you don't, then think about how you could do that. So it could be from putting something on your website. If you have a website, to say, you know, we welcome your feedback on how accessible we are and ways that we could improve. Please feel free to send us an email at this address, or you can call us at this phone number. You can come in, give us feedback, you know, just list all the different ways that people can give you feedback. Getting feedback also is a really great way to figure out what are some of the barriers that maybe are existing in your organization that you might not know about because you don't have a disability yourself. It's also a really great way to develop goodwill, because to be honest, if somebody has had a negative experience because of an accessibility issue with your organization, I think it's way better for them to tell you that feedback right away rather than telling their friends and their neighbors and casting a bad light on your organization. So if you're proactive about really encouraging people to give you feedback, and there's some steps you need to have in place, you need to develop in your policy a decision by when you're going to get back to people. Let's say maybe your organization commits to getting back to people within 7 days from their feedback, and you need to respond to them, and you need to do, you need to talk about how you're going to address whatever accessibility barrier that they've experienced. Also, hopefully they've given you good feedback, and if they've given you some good feedback about how accessible your organization is and the experience that they had, then by all means share that. Spread the good news so people know. Now, before I move on to the other standards, I wanted to talk about, again, size of organization. So here's where counting the number of employees you have is important. Under the customer service standard, a large organization, and so I'm going to talk about large and small organizations. For nonprofits and for-profits, a small organization under the customer service standard is an organization that has less than 20 employees. If you have more than 20 employees, then there's some additional obligations under the customer service standard that I'm going to talk about now. So if you're a large organization, one that has 20 or more employees, the additional things you need to do is to not only create a policy on accessible customer service, but you actually have to put the policy in writing. So the other piece of that is if you're a small organization, you have to develop the policy, but you don't necessarily need to put it in writing. However, I would strongly encourage you to do that. The other thing that you need to do if you're a large organization is to let your customers know that they can get copies of your customer service standard policy upon request. And that if you have somebody who requests a copy of that policy and they need it in a different format for accessibility reasons, that you are obligated to provide it. The other thing is that organizations with 20 or more employees are also obligated to report their compliance to the government at specific times. And there's been 2 times so far in 2014 and in the next one's coming up in 2017, where you need to tell the government basically that you are in compliance with the customer service standard. If you haven't done that, if you didn't do the one, there was one in 2012, there was one in 2014, if you didn't do the most recent one in 2014, then get in touch with Service Ontario and begin that process to let them know that you are compliant. Everyone else, in 2017, there'll be an announcement to say that the reporting portal is open, and there will be lots of ways, I'm sure, that people will let you know that that's open. And then you'll be obligated by the end of that year, by the end of 2017, to confirm your compliance with all of the AODA standards where you had deadlines already passed. For the customer service standard, that came into effect for all nonprofits as well as for-profits as of January 1st, 2012. You should have been compliant with everything that I've just talked about. And again, if you haven't been, if you're not compliant, or if you've got more questions than perhaps we have time to get into today, my contact information will be available at the end, and I'm happy to get into a little bit more detail with you and explain what your requirements are. But just note that it was January 1st, 2012 when you should have met those compliance requirements, so make that a priority if you're not compliant. A couple of tips, customer service tips that maybe I could share with you, and that's to avoid stereotypes and generalizations. Learn appropriate and respectful language. Ask before you help someone. So they may not need help, so ask them. Don't assume. Again, when we talked about progressive disabilities or intermittent disabilities, one day to the next, somebody may or may not need your help, so check in with them. Give the best customer service you can, get to know their needs, communicate in a way that takes into account a person's disability, and think about alternative ways to provide service. So the more accessible you can make it, the better. The one thing I also wanted to note about the customer service standard, what it doesn't require you is to make your programs and services accessible, but what it requires of you is to actually make information about your programs and services accessible. So there's a distinction there. It's not making, you don't have to put all of your information, as an example, all your written information into Braille. It's not asking that, but it's saying if somebody has a sight impairment and they come to your organization and you've got some written material and they can't read it, you're obligated under the customer service standard to find a way to work with them to get that information so that they can understand it, which could mean reading it out loud. It could mean sending it in the body of an email. It could be creating an audio format of it. There's lots of different ways to do it. So that is your requirement under the customer service standard. So again, Matt, I'll get you to, if you don't mind, clean out the questions box. So as we go forward, we can use that. So now let's talk about the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation. So as I mentioned, this is a sort of a sub-umbrella of the AODA under which there's 4 standards. Here we can see them: the Communications and Information Standard, the Employment Standard, Transportation Standard, and Design of Public Spaces Standard. I also mentioned that there were some general overarching requirements in addition to the requirements under each of the IASR standards. And these include developing policies to support each standard, and it would be only those that are relevant to you. Establishing and maintaining a multi-year accessibility plan that outlines strategies to prevent and remove barriers. That particular requirement is actually for large organizations only. And here's where it gets, again, a little bit complicated. So you'll remember under the customer service standard, I said that a large organization was one that had 20 or more employees. Under the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, they changed the definition of a large organization. So for the 4 remaining standards, a large organization is one that has 50 or more employees. So it means if you are an organization with 50 or more employees, you need to create a multi-year plan. Just give me a minute, I'm going to take a sip of tea. There we go. Another obligation that everyone has is to train your employees and volunteers about the IASR, so about those standards, as well as about the Ontario Human Rights Code as it relates to people with disabilities. So training has to be provided to anyone who also participates in developing your organization's policies, so that might be your board members, and anyone who provides goods or services or facilities on your organization's behalf. So sometimes you might have a contractor or you might subcontract to an organization to deliver some services. They would need to receive training on the AODA in general. So here we're talking about the integrated standards. They would also have to know about your policies, your specific organization's policies, and review your multi-year plan and so on. And then self-service kiosks. So that's a requirement where you have to consider accessibility features when designing or buying a self-service kiosk. Typically, that could be things like, so if you're in a library example, I know there's a couple of libraries with us today, so being able to check out your own book, that machine that let you scan your card and you put the books on, that's an example of a self-service kiosk. Filling your own gas and being able to pay at a station, that's an example of a self-service kiosk. Paying for a parking ticket is another example. There's lots. There's an increasing number of self-service kiosks in our communities. But one that I wanted to point out, or a couple I want to point out in particular just to get you thinking, a point-of-sale device, so that that machine that you get given to insert your debit card or credit card to pay for something, that's considered a self-service kiosk. Also considered a self-service kiosk would be, for instance, a nonprofit that has a computer that they make available for their clients, for instance, maybe for job searching. So people can come in, they can go on the computer, they can use it to write their resumes, to look up job openings and so on. That then becomes a self-service kiosk. So what you're required if you're a nonprofit or a for-profit is to consider accessibility features when you're designing or buying a new self-service kiosk. And then finally, the last item there, procurement, is actually one that relates to the public sector organizations, and they have some obligations to consider accessibility in their procurement process. Here we have the deadlines, and you can again see that I've got them for large and small nonprofits, and I do have deadlines for other types of organizations in the handout at the end. So if you don't see your type of organization represented here, then just again take a look at the link that I've given you in the resource handout. You can see The deadlines basically have all passed, so all organizations by now should have their accessibility policies as they relate to the IASR standards. That large organizations should have created their multi-year plans, and that those who have self-service kiosks going forward, designing or buying new ones, need to be thinking about self-service kiosks. Oh, sorry, need to be thinking about accessibility. The one, and I'm sorry about that, I'm just seeing here, oh sorry, I just need to go back. I just realized, slipped off the screen there, so my apologies, is training. I want to mention verbally, and we can recreate the PDF that you're going to get. The training dates, so large organizations, large nonprofits should have done their training. Oh, actually, sorry, it is there. It's just kind of wrapped around. So training, you can see, is on the bottom left, and wrapped around onto the top right are the deadlines. So January 1st, 2015 was the deadline for organizations to train their staff and volunteers if they were a large organization. Small organizations had until January 1st, 2016 to train their staff and volunteers on the IASR. So as we move forward from the general obligations under the IASR to the specific standards, we start with the Information and Communication Standard. And the goal of this is to help people with disabilities access information and communications that many of us rely on every day. And so the requirements are that if you provide accessible, or if you have emergency and public safety information, that you need to make it accessible if you're asked for it. So if you don't have any emergency or public safety information, it's not saying that you need to create it. It only says if you have it, that if somebody says, I can't understand it, can I get it in an alternative format, you must do that. You must work with them to find out what format's going to be best. The other is to provide accessible formats and communication supports if somebody requests it, so that they can access any information or communications your organization has. So say, for instance, you have an inaccessible website and somebody is trying to access some of the information that's on there, they can contact you and say, you know, I was on this page on your website, I couldn't read it with my screen reader, can I get that information in a different way? And you would work with them to figure out how best to get them that information. Feedback. So here this gets repeated from the customer service standard. And what it's asking you here is if you've created some ways for people to give you feedback, and somebody has, maybe as an example, all of those ways involve somebody physically coming to your site, and somebody for some reason with a disability is not able to come to your site. The Information Communication Standard requires you to find a way for them to be able to give you feedback despite the fact that they can't come to your site, and do it in the ways that you typically collect feedback. So for that reason, I always encourage people to really be broad right from the beginning, to think about all the different ways that you could collect feedback and then share that broadly so people can just pick the way that works the best for them to give you the feedback that they want to give you. The other is related to websites. So this is another requirement that applies to large organizations only. So large being organizations with 50 or more employees. Here you have to ensure that new or significantly refreshed websites are made accessible and meet international standards for accessibility, which is a standard called WCAG, which is WCAG for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Happy to share more information with you on that if you need, and also the ONN's website's got some resources, a lot of resources actually, really great resources to go deeper into anything that I'm talking about today. I've put onto ONN's website in the resource section. There's some really great stuff there that I'd encourage you to take a look at. But again, you're more than welcome to get in touch with me to chat about any of this. Deadlines. So the emergency public safety requirement came into effect as of January 1st, 2012. So that's been in effect for a while. Feedback, and that is also now in place for everybody. Accessible formats, small organizations will have to do this as of January 1st, 2017. So basically, if anybody asks for information in accessible format, you need to do that starting the top of next year. And websites, it was as of January 1st, 2014 going forward. Moving on to the employment standard. This is about making accessibility a regular part of the finding and hiring and supporting of employees with disabilities. And it builds on your existing requirements under the Ontario Human Rights Code to accommodate people with disabilities to the point of undue hardship. The first requirement that came into effect under the employment standard relates to preparing individualized emergency response information for employees with disabilities. But the standard also requires employers to establish processes to ensure that recruitment is accessible. So for example, you need to notify the public that accommodations can be made during interviews, for instance, if someone needs it. Employers are also required to provide workplace information and communications in accessible formats, ensure the accessibility needs of employees are considered through the full spectrum of employment opportunities, including performance management, career development, and redeployment. And here again, organizations with 50 or more employees have some additional requirements. They need to develop policies and procedures around creating individual accommodation plans to accommodate persons with disabilities who are employees. And they need to develop a return to work policy and process for employees who have been absent due to a disability. It's a big topic, and again, on ONN's website, there's a great resource put out by the Conference Board of Canada called the Employer's Toolkit. So if HR is part of your responsibility, I'd encourage you to go take a look at that handout, because there's a lot of templates and examples of policies, and it'll be very, very helpful to you. In terms of dates and deadlines, I won't spend much time on here, but you can see large organizations should have had this in place as of the top of this year, January 1st, 2016, and small organizations should be working on it now because they need to be compliant as of January 1st, 2017. And as I mentioned, the workplace emergency information, ensuring that any employees that have a disability and that might need assistance during an emergency have a plan created for them. That was to have been done from January 1st, 2012 and going forward as you have new employees. I have a couple of slides with some best practices, but given the time, I'm going to skip those, and you'll have copies of the slides that you can download, so you can take a look at that on your own. There's some about interviewing, some on recruitment. And then we move on to the third standard under the IASR, which is the transportation standard. And so this one is really about making it easier for everyone to travel in Ontario. And the requirements under this standard primarily apply to municipalities and or organizations that work on behalf of municipalities to operate conventional or specialized transit. In addition, the public sector organizations such as hospitals and colleges and universities and school boards that provide transportation services have some responsibility under this standard. So generally the transportation standard does not apply to nonprofits, again, unless they're contracted to deliver services on behalf of a municipality or another obligated organization. And then we're on to the last standard, and that's the Design of Public Spaces standard. And this is the most recent of all the 5 standards to have been made law. And it looks to improving public spaces like playgrounds, public parking areas, recreational trails, and some of the things that you can see listed on the slide. The accessibility standards for public spaces only affect new construction and planned redevelopment. Anything related to buildings, so you see that there's not a lot here, if anything, that's related to buildings themselves. And that's because those accessibility requirements are covered under a companion legislation, and that is the Ontario Building Code. So if you have some questions about what maybe your obligations are, excuse me, under the Ontario Building Code, do a quick search for accessibility in Ontario Building Code. Again, like the Design of Public Standard, it's on a go-forward basis, so any existing spaces and buildings are grandfathered. But if you're doing any redevelopment or building a new public space or a new building, you definitely will have some obligations to ensure that they're accessible. And just as a reminder again, so organizations with 20 or more employees will need to file their compliance reports in 2017 once that portal is opened. And if you haven't, if you should have reported your compliance and you haven't done it for the previous years, then do get in touch with Service Ontario so that they can take that information from you. So lots of information, lots and lots of information on the AODA. So I'm sure there's some questions, and Matt's been watching the questions and will come on. Maybe we have time for a few. And again, if you have any that we don't have a chance to get to today, then we can absolutely follow up with you afterwards and answer those. So, Matt?
Thank you so much for that informative presentation, Constance. We really appreciate it. Just because it's 1 o'clock now, we're going to quickly take a look at maybe 1 or 2 questions. And the first one is coming from Dale, and he asks, if a charitable organization is managed by volunteers with no paid staff, then are they exempt from the AODA?
Yeah, great question. So at the beginning I had mentioned that there's sort of 2 groups that would be exempt, and this is one of them, Dale. So if you have a nonprofit that is 100% led by volunteers, so sometimes, you know, one group maybe is a bird watching group, right, where they've incorporated, they're a nonprofit, but they really are, they just come together to share a hobby. They don't have anybody that they've hired to do any administration or anything like that. They're all volunteers. They do not need to comply with the AODA. As soon as you hire someone full-time, part-time, seasonal, or on contract, even for a short time, then you would need to comply with the standards under the AODA.
So the next question is from Yvette, and she asks, do we include contract and seasonal staff when counting employees?
Yeah, great question. Yes, you do.
Great, short answer. So we'll go to one more then, because that was so short. This is from Megan. For customer service standards, what do you do if your organization's product is information?
So if your product is information, so again, both under the customer service standard and under the information communication standards, you will be obligated to provide that information in an accessible format so that somebody with a disability can understand it. So you would need to work with that person to figure out what is the alternative format that they need. So again, under the customer service standard, it's not the products themselves that need to be made accessible, but it's information about those products. There is the companion legislation, which I've referred to a couple of times, called the Ontario Human Rights Code. And so, you know, there you need to make some accommodations to the point of undue hardship. So what I'd say, maybe, was it Yvette who asked that question?
Yeah, that one was from Megan.
Megan. Okay, Megan. So I'd suggest you get in touch with me afterwards and we can drill down a little bit about this, because it is a fairly specific question to your organization, and I'm happy to share some resources with you to figure out what you need to do under the AODA and under the Ontario Human Rights Code.
Beautiful, thank you. So that's all the time we have for today, but again, thank you so much, Constance, for helping us learn more about complying with the AODA, and thank you to everyone for taking your time out of your lunch hour to join us. Just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website within the next week, and the webinar slides and handouts are still available for you to download in that GoToWebinar panel. As well, this is especially for everyone who had questions that we weren't able to get to, we have a brief post-webinar survey that's going to launch just after this session. So if you have any additional questions, you can opt in to have Constance follow up with you, and you'll start an email conversation between the two of you where you can ask any questions and have her answer them directly. And that's all. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Take care.
Thanks so much, TechSoup, for having ONN do this webinar, and thanks to all of you for joining me today. Take care.